Hello, and welcome to the second episode of Tea for One. I'm your host, Rowan, and we will dive into all topics tea related: biology, history, culture, growing, producing tea, and so much more. Episode 2 will focus on green tea. When and where is the origin of tea? How does Camellia sinensis make tea? How are green teas used today? Hopefully we can answer all those questions by the end of this episode. So, before we begin, I highly recommend you get a nice cup of tea and find a peaceful spot to listen as we talk about Camellia sinensis. Green tea, a type of tea known for vast and unique flavors. While most can be described as fresh, clean, and earthy, most green tea variations are a light green, yellow, to a deep gold color. There are numerous kinds of green tea produced from China and Japan, while each having a special step in their production, but all green teas start out the same. Green tea is made exclusively from the leaves of Camellia sinensis, and to prevent the oxidation process, the leaves are cooked almost immediately after being plucked. This preserves high concentrations of chlorophyll, polyphenols, and antioxidants, which helps make green tea green tea. Similar to the origins of Earl Grey tea, there are many legends to the origin of tea itself. One popular tale is about the Chinese legend Emperor Shen Nong in about 2737 BC. The emperor had just made a bowl of freshly boiled water when a few leaves fell into his cup from a nearby tree. These leaves changed the color and the taste of the water, and when the emperor took a sip, he was pleasantly surprised by the flavor and the restorative properties. A variation of this legend describes Shen Nong testing different medical properties of herbs. Some of these were poisonous, but he found an antidote in tea. Another story credits Bodhidharma, the founder of Chan Buddhism, as the creator of tea. The tale says that Bodhidharma accidentally fell asleep while meditating in front of a wall for 9 years. Then he awoke in such disgust at his weakness that he snipped off his own eyelids. The eyelids fell to the ground and took root, growing into tea bushes. First evidence of Camellia sinensis being used found by cultural historians wasn't even tea. They found that in Southeast Asia over 3,000 years ago, people picked tea leaves to chew or eat for recreation. Some of these first recordings of green tea being consumed dated back in the 2nd century by Emperor Jing of Han. Organic matter was found in his mausoleum, and through mass spectrometry it was found that to be Camellia sinensis, though there are some writings that suggest it was drunk earlier. Some records in China suggest that tea was made as far back as 10th century BC. However, the Chinese word for tea only came into being about in the 8th century AD. Though it is not certain, but historians think tea in older texts was referred to as bitter vegetable. Back in the days of Emperor Jin Han, tea was most likely consumed for medical benefits, namely rejuvenation. A text from this time states, "To drink the bitter tea constantly makes one think better." It wasn't until around the 700s that green tea was being consumed for pleasure. It was about this time where tea started being consumed as a flavorful beverage rather than cough syrup that it started to leave China. Tea and its practices spread to Korea, Japan, and Vietnam, where each country began to change and adapt tea culture as their own. Before we get too far in the rabbit hole of the origins of tea, let's discuss what actually is tea. As I have mentioned before, the scientific name of the plant that tea comes from is Camellia sinensis, not to be confused with the tea tree, which tea tree oil comes from. These two plants are not related or similar at all, and yes, it feels confusing and misleading on purpose. Anyways, this camellia plant is native to East Asia, the Indian subcontinent, and Southeast Asia, but today it's cultivated around the world in tropical and subtropical regions. China and India are the world's biggest tea producers, though plantations can be found scattered around the world. There are even some in the southeast of the US. Camellia sinensis is an evergreen shrub tree that usually grows to around 2 meters or 6.5 feet tall. But this height is typically cut in half around tea plantations. It has blossoms about the size of a ping pong ball with white petals and a yellow center. The tea leaves themselves can fit in your hand, maxing out about 15 centimeters or almost 6 inches. Fresh leaves contain about 4% caffeine, as well as related compounds like theobromine, which can also be found in cocoa and chocolate. Another fun fact about Camellia sinensis is it contains about 3 billion base pairs in its genome, which is much larger than other plants previously sequenced and about the same length as our genome as humans. Tea almost almost exclusively comes from tea leaves, and those leaves almost exclusively are the youngest of the plant. The young leaves are light green, while the other leaves are a darker green. Besides the color and size, the young leaves and the old leaves also have different chemical makeup. This means brewing young leaves versus the old ones will taste different. So in tea harvesting, it is typical that the bud or the tip of the plant, along with the first 2 or 3 leaves, are used for tea. Tea is typically harvested 3 times a year in flushes. The first flush takes place in late April to early May, then the second harvest usually takes place from June through July, and the third picking takes place in late July to early August. The first flush in the spring brings the best quality leaves with the higher prices to match. As mentioned earlier, green tea is processed differently from black teas as well as all other kinds of teas like oolong, puree, and rooibos tea. To make the green tea, you have to pick young leaves and quickly heat the leaves to prevent excessive oxidation. These processes are broken down into 2 categories: artisanal or modern methods. Sun drying, basket or charcoal firing, or pan firing are all common artisanal methods, while oven drying, tumbling, and steaming are all common modern methods. By the way, this process of heating leaves is all part of tea making, but the time between picking and heating, as well as possible fermentation of the leaves, are key differences in the tea types. In this stage, only after a couple heat cycles, the tea is in an unrefined state called aracha. Aracha is typically refired multiple times to increase the shelf life as well as better the flavor. After these re-drying processes, the crude tea is sifted and graded according to size. Then each batch of tea will be blended and tasted by the testers. Professional tea tasting is definitely an odd job, but is held in high regard in certain parts of the world. In this way, tea tasting is very similar to what winemakers and beer brewers do: sample the newest batch and shape it to what they want in their drink. A lot of tea companies like Lipton have a scale to rate each tea style, like their green tea citrus. This ensures that the teas will taste the same from year to year, despite having different harvesting seasons. A lot of big wine and beer makers also have this standard, and makes the company reliable for their products. We have started from the plant, and now we are nearing the end of green tea's journey. But green tea is a very broad category, so let's dive into some different common types of green tea. So I don't just ramble on for hours on end, let's just stick with a couple green teas from China and Japan. Green tea is the most widely produced type of tea from China, with 1.42 million tons grown in 2014, and that number is estimated to double by next year. To put this more in perspective, a pound of green tea would make about 200 cups. That's a lot of tea. So, what are some of these teas that China produces a ton of? One of my personal favorites is called gunpowder tea. In Chinese, it's called tucha, meaning pearl tea, because the tea leaves are rolled into small, round, dark green pellets. The reason why it's rolled into pearls is to protect the flavor and the nutrients. The English name comes from the resemblance of grains of gunpowder. This type of green tea dates back to when tea was starting to get really popular, about the 700s. Traditionally, each leaf was rolled by hand, however today, all but the absolute highest quality gunpowder teas are rolled by machine. Gunpowder tea has many variations, but most have a savory, woodsy flavor that's a bit smoky, fitting for its name. Another popular Chinese tea is called Longjin, or Dragonwell tea in English. This tea comes from Longjin village in the province of Zhejiang. Dragonwell tea is produced mostly by hand and renowned for its high quality. Its appearance can vary, but most look a golden green in long, thin, uniform strips. Like a few other kinds of green teas, Dragonwell is pan-roasted. This is done by using a wok-like pan at near boiling temperatures and shaking and pressing the leaves by hand. This process removes 70 to 80% of the water in the leaves. Authentic Longjin tea tastes sweet, mellow, and is rounded. Some varieties have a distinct vegetal and grassy taste, while others carry hints of roasted chestnut and butter. Chinese tea culture includes all facets of tea, both physical and spiritual, that significantly influence Chinese culture throughout history. Physically, it consists of the history of tea cultivation, brewing, serving techniques, methods of consumption, arts, and the tea ceremony. Tea culture has also a non-physical aspects like symbolic, spiritual, religious, psychological, and social. As tea has been a part of China for over 4,000 years, it continues to influence its people and its nation today. The tea ceremony is the union of both physical and spiritual sides of tea in Chinese culture. Tea ceremonies have been happening for thousands of years and consist of ceremonial preparation, presentation, and consumption of tea. The basis of the word ceremony in English is the best substitute for its Chinese meaning, of all things, courtesy comes first. The basic steps of this process include preparing the tea, offering or serving the tea, appreciating the tea, sniffing the tea, savoring and drinking, and tasting the tea. In Chinese tea culture, it is believed that tea drinking process is a spiritual enjoyment, an art, and a meaning of cultivating moral character as well as nourishing the mind. This is something you do in a peaceful setting, typically outside, with few people in a relaxed and tranquil state of mind. In Japanese tea culture, tea ceremonies are also extremely important, however they are different. One major difference in most tea ceremonies in Japan is they use matcha, a powdered green tea, which we will discuss more later on. Japanese tea ceremonies are primarily used for family, friends, and associates, and these ceremonies can vary from relatively simple hospitality to formal gatherings. There are special rooms and spaces in which these ceremonies take place, and some can last for up to 4 hours. The matcha that is served in these ceremonies come in 2 different styles: thin, or yusacha in Japanese, or thick, called koicha. These 2 styles of thick and thin matcha have been used in tea ceremonies in Japan since the 1500s. The names themselves are pretty self-explanatory, but thick is a heavier blend that has 3 times the amount of matcha compared to thin. Thick is typically used for high-grade matcha and is whisked in one bowl, then poured to guests separately, instead of thin that is made individually in each tea drinker's cup. Thin matcha is used more for daily consumption, while thick is typically made for special occasions. I don't know if you could pick up on this yet, but I love tea, and recently I have fallen in love with matcha. Matcha is a very unique tea for several reasons, but one of the biggest, as I mentioned before, is that matcha is powdered tea leaves. All other teas you steep in hot water to encourage diffusion of the flavors, but you don't actually drink the leaves. While in matcha, the leaves are grounded into a superfine powder, and when you drink matcha, you consume the entire leaf, which means you get all the nutritional benefits of tea. Tea is both a stimulant and a relaxer because of the caffeine and theanine it contains respectively. Among numerous other reasons, this is why tea was and still is very popular in temples, because it relieves stress but it also keeps the drinker focused. Since you consume the entire leaf with matcha, it is comparable to drinking 8 cups of green tea. Another aspect of matcha that makes it stand out among most other teas is that in the last 20 days before the young leaves are picked, the tea plants are put in shade. This process increases chlorophyll levels, produces more amino acids, particularly the de-stressor theanine. Great, matcha is a superfood that is incredible and magical, but how does it go from powder to liquid? Once you have your matcha in your cup in hot but not boiling water, then you need a chasen, a traditionally used bamboo whisk. The powder and water is whisked in a uniform consistency, leaving no lumps of tea. A cup of matcha should have mellow vegetal grassy notes, have some sweet nuttiness, be a tiny bit bitter, and possess a savory umami ending. Though matcha is very popular in Japan, it is not the most popular. That spot goes to sencha, representing about 80% of all tea produced by Japan. Sencha tea has rich evergreen colored leaves that produces a slightly cloudy but still vibrant chartreuse colored tea. Sencha differs from some teas as it is picked year-round, with the first flush being in spring, the highest quality. Sencha's tea production, as well as some other Japanese teas, differ from the Chinese green teas. Most Chinese green teas are pan-fired, while Japanese green teas are first steamed for about 15 to 20 seconds to prevent oxidation, then they are rolled, shaped, and dried. This difference in the production makes teas that are steamed greener in color, but also slightly more bitter than those that are pan-roasted. While there are many variations of sencha, most have a fresh, grassy flavor that also have nutty, floral, and fruity notes. We have briefly mentioned the health benefits from green teas, and tea in general, but I think we should dive into it a bit more. Throughout history, tea has been accredited for several different health benefits, especially green tea. Royalty and nobles across the world drank tea to cure ailments. Doctors and herbalists used particular tea blends to remedy particular illnesses. and people self-medicated their fatigue and sleepiness with Camellia sinensis. But, as much as I and many other people would love tea to be the elixir of life, it isn't. Dozens of studies have analyzed tea over the past few decades, and most of those studies have found the same conclusion. There isn't much evidence that points to tea being super beneficial to your health. However, the general consensus, with a few exceptions, is that tea, especially green tea, when consumed in moderation, can help your overall health minutely. Some studies claim that drinking green tea every day can lower the risk of cancer by a few percentages, while others argue the opposite. So please don't just drink tea to ward off cancer. There are a few suggested benefits of tea found so far through studies, one of which is heart disease. A long-term clinical study found that tea can make a small reduction in the risk of stroke and coronary artery disease, and slightly lowers systolic and diastolic blood pressures. Again, the research on this topic is very limited, so please take all of this with a grain of salt. There are a few studies that suggest that green tea and its antioxidants play a role in helping immune function, though this mechanism of action is unknown, and more research needs to be done. The last health benefit is the most understood and the sounder one: caffeine. Caffeine can help the body in many ways in moderate doses. That's the key phrase, moderate doses. For comparison, the average cup of coffee has 125 milligrams of caffeine. Matcha and black tea have about the same amount of caffeine at 60 milligrams, about half of that of what coffee is. Green tea only has 15 milligrams. A sparing amount of caffeine can boost focus and alertness, but too much can cause serious cardiovascular issues. While a cup of tea does not keep the doctor away, it can help slightly in some preventative measures. So the last episode, we talked about preparing the perfect cup of Earl Grey. Now we gotta talk about the perfect cup of green tea and matcha. Let's talk about regular green tea first. Similar to Earl Grey and all other teas, you want high quality water. Fresh spring water is the most preferred for green teas. Unlike other teas though, for 1 cup of green tea you only want about a teaspoon of dried leaves. A lot of green teas are whole leaves or larger pieces compared to that of black teas, so they expand a lot more with the steeping process. The optimal temperatures are from 61 Celsius or 142 Fahrenheit to 87 Celsius or 189 Fahrenheit. Note, this is much cooler than black teas, which are steeped at near boiling temperatures. The steeping time is also very different than that of black teas. Green teas usually brew anywhere from 30 seconds to 3 minutes, depending on the kind of tea. Generally, the lower quality teas are steeped at hotter temperatures for longer, while the higher quality teas are steeped at cooler temperatures for a shorter amount of time. This way, you can reuse the tea leaves for multiple cups. Typically, they can be used anywhere from 2 to 3 times. So, you have a beautiful cup of golden yellow green tea. What do you add to it, if anything? If you are just starting out drinking tea or have only had black teas before, it can be a bit jarring to have a cup of pure green tea. I suggest you add a bit of honey or lemon or both. You can add milk or milk substitutes to green tea, but because the flavor is so delicate, most people don't. In fact, I recommend you don't add anything to green tea, particularly those that are higher grade. Now let's talk about matcha. You want high quality water and the water temperature to be anywhere from 70 to 85 Celsius to 158 to 185 Fahrenheit. Instead of steeping leaves, you'll be whisking the fine powder until frothy and there is no more lumps. Because matcha is a lot stronger tasting than green teas, it is more common for people to add sweeteners in milks, although it is still very common to drink matcha straight. And since matcha can be a bit bitter, it is traditionally served with small sweet confections called wagashi, which can be made from bean paste, rice, fruits, and nuts. Something very unique to matcha, however, since it's a powder, is it can be incorporated into many different foods. Chocolate, cheesecake, cookies, pudding, ice cream, and even Kit Kats are all common to find matcha in. Matcha can be used in foods that aren't sweet too, like some tempura batter. Wow, that was a lot, but hopefully you learned something interesting about the history, culture, and the benefits of green tea. Next episode, we will dive into tea production from leaf to cup, as well as some oddball teas. This is Tea for One, and until next time.